Today's November 15th, 2011. My name is Roger Soysett. I'm here with Tony Hilliard at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia, where we are both volunteers. With us today is Mr. Urban Rump, a veteran who has agreed to share his personal experiences during his service during the Korean War. This interview is being recorded for the Library of Congress Veterans History Project through the efforts of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association. Mr. Rump, would you give us your full name and address and tell us your date of birth and maybe a little bit about your life as you were growing up?
Okay, first name is Urban, middle initial G, the last name Rump, R-U-M-P. Born 27 February 1931 in Burlington, Iowa. I was the oldest of 7 boys, no girls, and went through 14 years of education, the last 2 being at the University of Iowa, and that was in the 1950, June of 1950. My grade in high school education was at a Catholic school in Burlington, and when I finished Burlington Community College in 1950, I was going to work a year and then go back and finish my college. As you would know, then in that same month of June 1950, the Korean War started. Well, initially everyone thought, well, this isn't going to last very long. At first it looked dismal because they pushed them clear back down, but with reinforcements coming in, they were able to stabilize the situation down at the Pusan perimeter and push the Chinese and the North Koreans back north again. So everyone thought, well, their troops are all going to be home at Christmas time. There won't be any need to draft too many more people. Well, that wasn't the case. So in the middle of 1951, I was working in Kansas City, and I was living with a fellow that was a World War II veteran, and he was a Navy pilot. And he said, well, it looks like things are going to, they're going to accelerate the draft. And he said, why don't you consider getting into the Navy and take a test out there and see if you could get go into the Navy as a Navy air cadet. He was a Navy pilot, he being a Navy pilot. So I took the test and passed it and got a deferment from my draft board for 6 months. And everything looked fine, and I was awaiting call from the Navy, to report. And then I received a notice from them that said we've had so many apply that we've had to raise the test standards. And as a result of this raising of test standards, why, it eliminates you. Well, it didn't take very long, and here come my draft board, and this was probably in about, I don't know, November of 1951, I guess, and they gave me 30 days notice to prepare myself for inductions into the military. That little letter from your President of the United States. They gave me, I think it was 6th of January of 1952, to report to the local draft board, which I did in Burlington, Iowa. And they transported us to Des Moines and processed us there. Then assigned us to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. This was by bus. All this travel at that time was by bus. Down at Fort Leonard, we languished around for probably 10 days or whatever, and not knowing what was going to happen or whatever, where our training would be. And of course, when you're in the Army, or any military, there's all of these rumors flying around where you're going to go, what you're going to be doing, et cetera, et cetera. So you really didn't know if you were going to go into the Marines or the Navy. The chances were Army, because that was the majority of the placements. After about 10 days, I guess it was, we received notice that we were going to go to California. Well, no one even knew where in California. We were going to go to California, and we're going to be on this troop train. They heard us on this troop train, and that train stopped at every whistle stop, and it had to stop for every train coming the opposite direction. You had to pull off to the side. Well, by this time it's somewhere, I guess, around the 1st of March, and it was pretty warm out in the desert. It was warm anyhow, to the point where it was very uncomfortable in these train cars, and you would just sit there. And I think it took probably a good week and a half to get to California. I can't ever remember where we disembarked there, but the next thing they assigned us to Camp Roberts, California. This was an infantry training camp that had been reactivated for the Korean War. It had never completely shut down during after World War II, but they reactivated it, and we had thousands of troops out there training. And during the training process, I had been interested in sports before I went into the service, and I was in pretty good physical condition because I maintained my physical conditioning even though I was working. And as a result of that, during basic training and that, it really wasn't very difficult at all for me to do the physical work that was involved in basic training. And our officer, one of the lieutenants, noticed that I was kind of, you might say, excelling in this type of work, exercising. And he asked me if I would be assigned to work in special services, which is primarily sports and working with others, training in whatever classes they may want you to do. And I got involved in a boxing tournament out there. I had a little experience in it before I went into service. And I get into this tournament, and it was the 8th Army boxing tournament, and we had different eliminations through various fights, and I ended up in San Francisco at the Presidio. And up to that time, any of the bouts I had, it was pretty easy. I mean, these fellows were in it kind of just for the fun of it, you know, and something to do. And I got up into California, and I ran across some guy that was from Idaho. I'll never forget this. He was from Idaho, and he'd been an AAU boxing champion. Well, needless to say, I mean, he turned me every way but loose. There went my special services category. And they went back, I guess, and looked at my papers and said, well, you do have some potential here in radio operators. And I said, well, I don't know anything about radio, but if that's what it is, well, I'm glad to take a chance at it. So anyhow, that's what I did. I took radio operators training. It was 8 weeks. And just to digress a second, I really have to give the military credit. They're able to take you right out of nowhere and train you into some pretty specific work, and detailed, and turn out pretty good people to do the job. I mean, of course, it's all focused on just one thing. You don't get all of the humanities that you would in schools, but they do a good job of training, and I got to give them credit for it. They write a program. You're drilled in it every day for, 8 weeks, something like that, and you come out of there and you're pretty well proficient in doing what they want you to do when you're involved in overseas or even domestic duty. Well, I received I think it was a week's leave to go back to my hometown before we shipped out, and naturally, comes the orders, it's FECOM, Far East Command, you know, so it's not Germany or one of the Alaska or any of that. So if you've got a class of about 200 or 300, you have 90% of them going to Far East Command, and the rest of them we break up between various parts of the world. So anyhow, there were 3 of us got in this car, 3 or 4 of us, and one of the fellows had a car, and he lived in central Missouri. And me being from Iowa, I thought, well, I'll just hitch a ride with him, which we did. We drove all night. I think it took us about 50 hours to get back home, driving continuous during the evening. And my dad came down and picked us up. Anyhow, I left there and after leave and flew out to California. Went to this camp out in right outside of Pittsburgh, California. It's on one of the inlets from the bay, and I was there probably another 2 weeks, waiting to ship out. Took us down to the loading docks. You have thousands of them standing there, waiting to board this ship, and you keep standing in line, and you're going up there calling your name out. You're in a certain order. Well, they came within about 10 with me, and they said, that's all we can take, go back to your barracks. So wait till the next ship comes along. So, well, okay, whatever. We go back and we waited not too long that second time. It was, they were rotating pretty fast, and I think it was probably less than a week. We told us that this time you would be boarding early on, so we got on the ship, and it was, I think, a little over 2 weeks. We were on board ship, and rough seas. I'll never forget, it was rough seas. No one went below deck. It seemed like it was ungodly acrid down there. The smell was so bad. You'd try to eat, you had these stand-up trays, you'd try to eat your food in that, and between your food sliding all over and the smell of the place and the taste of the food wasn't very good anyhow. Why, I think I must have lost 10 or 15 pounds in that 2 weeks, but that didn't bother me any. We landed in Yokohama, Japan. And that was Camp Drake, Japan. Processed there for just a day or two. It wasn't very long at all. And put us on another ship, and I think it took us by train down to Kobe, if I'm not mistaken. And from there we took another ship and landed at Busan, which is a deep water port in the southeast corner part of Korea. They assigned us after a few days to a replacement depot. It was a 502nd Signal Service Command, or Center, and we were there several days, quite a few of us, maybe 10 or 12 in the signal section, waiting for assignments. And they came by one day and said, we need 3 radio operators over at the Prisoner of War Command. Just surprisingly, amazingly enough, during radio operator school, during the whole time we went overseas, all this time up to point, there were 3 of us stayed together, always working in alphabetical order. There was a fellow by the name of Eddie Ponder, there was another guy by the name of Pratt, Owen Pratt, and myself, and it was Ponder, Pratt, and Rump. And those 3 alphabetical groups just stayed together. So when they needed 3 radio operators of the Prisoner of War Command, all 3 of us went together. Surprisingly enough, we stayed together the whole time until the time got for me to go home. And I received my orders to go home, surprisingly enough, about a week before them. And they said, you can't break the chain, you've got to wait. And I said, no, when it comes time to go home, we go home, you know. We'll rotate now, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit there. But we did go up to the Prisoner of War Command, and we were in headquarters company, and it was in an old military barracks, Japanese military barracks, and right on the bay of the Sea of Japan. And I'll get into something about that a little bit later on here. But this was an old military headquarters, didn't have any heat in it. Any heat you had was just little Bunsen burners or gas burners, I mean, propane. We had very poor power. Any power we had was Korean power, which was very undependable. Most generally you had to rely upon a generator. That we had a standby generator, which was always out of gasoline. It never failed. It would run 15 or 20 minutes and somebody say, did you check the gas? No, we didn't. And it'd run out of gas, so all communications would break down until we located some gas. And it was really hard scrabble work because we just didn't have any equipment, you know. And they had to create the Prisoner of War Command so fast that because of the influx of prisoners coming in, tens of thousands at a time, and the whole command had something, as I recall, we had 6 camps strategically located around the country, South Korea. I believe we had over, I'm guessing now, around 250,000 troops in these camps. And you know, they were mixed between North Koreans, they were mixed between Chinese. What a lot of people don't realize too, you had a tremendous amount of South Koreans who were forced into the North Korean army. As they came south, they just grabbed these guys and you're part of the North Korean army. They didn't want to be in the North Korean army, but they had no choice. They either did that or they were in trouble. So we had a lot of sympathetic, or if you will, allies in these camps. And of course they became trustees in most cases, but not in all cases. And
how did the South Korean government feel towards these people?
Towards the ones that had
towards
been
the
abducted?
South Koreans who'd been forced in.
They were sympathetic to them. They knew the situation, that they had been forced into that. In fact, Sigmund Rhee, during the armistice talks, towards the end, I mean, I'm trying to think now, maybe in around 3 or 4 months before the armistice, he opened up our camps and just let these guys go, released them out into the public, which didn't endear himself very well to the United States, because we felt that they should be part of a repatriation group in total. And a lot of them escaped, went out of the countryside. But let me go back again a little bit more. One of the camps was on Koji Island. They call them Koji-do, do being an island in Korean, and the other island, and that was just south of Busan, maybe 15 miles, something like that, very close by. They could run it back and forth with just little launches. I don't think it's even 15 miles, it's more like 5 or 6 miles. The other one was Jeju-do, and that was like 300 miles south, and that's where primarily the Chinese were. Those were the bad guys, the ones that were causing a lot of the problems. And during the initial part of the camp formation on Koji-do, the prisoners broke loose and actually took the commanding general of the prisoner of war command and captured him and had him and held him in hostage there. An American general was captured by prisoners. And so they obviously had to beef up their strength all the way around. They just weren't that well organized, and they took in so many of them, you know. It was difficult to get everything up to speed. And well, you can imagine, we didn't have enough radio operators and command head and company headquarters. We were division strength, but we weren't a division. We were actually separate units. They called them AUs, auxiliary units. And at the end of the war, that was disbanded, so it no longer exists. Our camp headquarters company was 8203 AU, and we had them 8205, 6, 7, whatever. And we began to function rather well. We put in a lot of hours. They were very, very long hours. We were understaffed, but we did well. We performed our job, and we did very good. We started to get additional equipment in, which made our job not necessarily easier, but more effective, more reliable. And we had to funnel all our information back through the 8th Army into Tokyo, and most of our communications that we initiated ran from our command headquarters to the South Korean headquarters, which at that time was in Seoul. They had pushed them back far enough that we had a unit up in Seoul that most of ours, and then from there it went to Japan, all of the information as regards camp conditions, strength, supplies, etc., etc. And then it progressed down through the military chain, up and down the military chain from there. But we did a good job, spent a lot of hours. Those were long hours, 7 days a week in most cases. So when people say that even though you're a rear unit you got easy duty, well, yeah, they're not shooting at you, but you're putting in a lot of hours.
What was, it was camp 8201?
8203, ours was 8203 AU.
And that was where?
That was located in Busan. By the way, it was located on the Sea of Japan, and coincidentally enough, I was at the Old Soldiers Parade in Alpharetta here just a few weeks ago, and we had 3 Koreans, native Koreans who live in this area, came to the parade with us, and they're walking in the parade. And we got talking about things, you know, and he asked me where I was at, and I told him, and I said, you know, we were right on the Bay of Japan out there. I said, a real nice beach. I said, there was a big steel mill right next to us, the abandoned steel mill, and we were in this Japanese military academy. He knew exactly where it was. He said, yeah, I know it. He was in the Korean Army. And he said, I know exactly where it's at. He said, right now that's a resort area. There's like high-rise hotels and beaches and condos and, you know, like you would see in any resort area we have in this country right now. And coincidentally enough, Jeju Island, where the Chinese were, it is also a resort area. And people from all over the Far East come there. That's a good source of tourist revenue for the state of, for the country of South Korea rather. But we were we had a group of about, at company headquarters there, we had about 6 radio operators, plus we had teletype operators, and our commanding general at that time was a general by the name of Lionel McGarr. General McGarr, he's a 1-star, and after the war I followed him up a little bit. He was commander, or rather president, of the War Command College. Past that, I never heard much about him. I wasn't able to trace him any further. At that time, he was probably in his early 50s, I'm guessing. Maybe, yeah, probably in his 50s. Our signal officer at that time was a lieutenant colonel out of the reserves in California, San Bernardino. His name was Robert Wynn, W-Y-N-N. Very nice gentleman, white-haired, wasn't very much of a disciplinarian. He was pretty loose. He really didn't care to be reactivated back into the military, and he was called out of the reserves, which a lot of World War II veterans were called back out of the reserves. During this period of time, my brother had been, my next one down to me by the name of John, Jack we called him. He had taken his training, came to Korea, and was in an artillery unit. And I can't remember the name of the artillery unit, except they fired in support of, I believe, and the reason I'm guessing on a lot of this, trying to recall memory, I had all of his records and I lost them. Well, I didn't lose them. My wife lost them. She mislaid them at a train station once, and we never did find them. We were on our way going someplace, and she left them laying there, and I was never able to get them back. And his wife gave me everything he had, and I just can't remember what units he was firing in support, but they had 8-inch guns. They were the largest guns in Korea. They were pretty much of a semi-fixed installation. You didn't move those around too easy. And I asked for and received TDY to go up there and visit with him. And I rode a 6x during all night. I rode trains going through dark tunnels and soot and everything, dirt from the trains. And was able to visit with him for 7 days. And we were firing in support of various operations up there. And I have pictures of this, helped him build bunkers, rather. And we took a few incoming rounds, not too many. We were probably between 4 and 5 miles back of the main line. So we were, you know, pretty well out of harm's way, you might say. However, as I recall, I was riding in this 6x, and I got to going up there that morning. I've ridden all night, and that thing jarring me all over the place. And I get up there, and I asked somebody where his unit was, and they told him it was right over here, about 2 miles. So I'm walking across this gravel road, going over there, and it was kind of out in the open, and finally some guy coming along in a Jeep, and he said, "Mister, do you know where you're going?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, you better get the hell off of the road if you want to get to the other side." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Man, they'll pick you off, snipers will." So I said, "Well, okay, can you give me a lift?" And he said, "Sure," and he took me on out. But I'm just walking aimlessly down this road, and I had no idea that I was exposing myself that much. And of course, snipers were in and out. They never stayed in one place, you know. Fortunately, nothing ever happened that I heard of, but it was a good warning to me that I didn't realize what I was doing. Thank goodness you had somebody to help you, alert you to this, you know. But I stayed with him for 7 days, and I was quite an experience visiting with your brother in a combat zone in Korea. And so I asked his commanding officer if I could stay there, and they said, "Well, you could if your commanding officer releases you." And I said, "Well, I don't know, it shouldn't be much of a problem." So through means of communication, they both agreed this could be done, but at that time you had to have your parents' permission for brothers to be stationed at the same location, especially in a combat zone. And my mother and father turned me down. My mother primarily turned me down on that because she was fully aware of the Sullivan brothers being lost out of Waterloo, Iowa, you know, which wasn't too far from us. And they were kind of Iowa heroes, so to speak. And having lost all those brothers at one time during this time that ship was sunk, she wasn't in favor of this. So that pretty well stopped that. But probably the best. You know, I can appreciate her feelings in that respect, you know. But I returned back down there, and then the armistice progressed to the point where the North Koreans were starting to become a little more receptive to things, negotiations, and they came up with this Operation Little Switch. And Operation Little Switch was returning of the sick and wounded prisoners back to the North Koreans at Panmunjom. And I asked my commanding officer at that time, Colonel Wynn, if I could be part of that. And he said, well, you know, I'd rather you did that, rather you stay here, but I kept pestering him, and because I felt this was really kind of an important part of history, an important part of the war, that I would like to experience that. And so he finally relented, and I was on these trains that were repatriating sick and wounded. And these were primarily hospital trains, and they have the bunks that fold out from the side, and these sick prisoners or the sick patients laying in those bunks, 90% of them had tuberculosis. Some of them had war injuries due to lost limbs or hands or whatever, but in addition to having tuberculosis. And I was a car commander, what you call a car commander. And at each end of the car we had guys with automatic weapons, and we had Swedish Red Cross representatives on board these trains, making sure that everything was being done according to Geneva Convention rules, you know, for exchanging prisoners. And we went along pretty good. There was no real problems until one night, and this was like 3 days and 2 nights to get all the way up there, because you're going through this very antiquated rail lines. They're not too good a shape. They've been repaired and replaced due to war conditions, and you're going through these tunnels, and these were locomotives. They weren't diesel. These were locomotives. It was constantly, they were coal burning, and they had to stop frequently for water, as you would know a locomotive would have to. But we'd also go through these tunnels, and these trains weren't too well lit to begin with. By the time you were halfway through one of these tunnels, it was practically dark of night because there wasn't enough light in them, you know. And of course, at the time you get done with one of the 3 days of this, you're covered with soot from one end to the other. You know, your face and arms and that are black. And I have pictures, and unfortunately I didn't bring them with me, but I show pictures where you could get off the train, and they'd have little South Korean vendors there, and they'd have little tubs, and they have pitchers of water and a hand towel, and you'd give them some money for this, and you could splash it on your face and clean yourself up. And this was a way they actually made an income off of this, treating people coming through these dark tunnels and that, all full of soot. Not only us, but there are native people that are also traveling. So we exchanged prisoners up there. It was kind of interesting. All the way up, the prisoners, they didn't want to eat anything. They wanted to look emaciated when they got there. They were tearing their clothing. We'd have to stop them from that because they wanted to look like they were being mishandled, mistreated. You know, this is what the impression they wanted to give the public once they stepped off these trains. And they wouldn't eat anything, and so we tried to get them to eat their kimchi. We had these big vats of kimchi, which is a very pungent, strong Korean native dish to this day even. And they didn't want to eat this. They didn't want to eat that. They wanted RC rations. Well, you're not going to get RC rations, you know. This is what we have to eat. We don't have any food like you've got native food. We want RC rations. So we weren't going to allow them to do that. Well, then when it come time to depart, leave the train, we had a Korean there reading off the names, and they wouldn't pay any attention to him. You know, they would just sat there. And so finally I grabbed the list from them, and I'll never forget this. And I told them through the interpreter, "Sir, you're either going to come off on your own or we'll take you off. It's your choice, you know, but you will leave the train." So I started reading these names the best I could they were printed out in English language, you know. And I guess they felt they better pay attention because they all started to leave the train pretty orderly and put them into either ambulances or walking, as the case may be.
Did you not have any of them that didn't want to go?
At that point, yeah, you did, and they went to a holding area, and this is another thing, a lot of them turned up, well, put it this way, the Chinese wanted to go back, 90% of them that wanted to go back. The North Koreans, for the most part, did. There were a lot of them that didn't want to go back, and in fact, that was the majority of prisoners did not want to go back. They stayed behind in these holding areas, you know. But the sick and wounded, now that we were taking back, they all wanted to go back. They didn't want to stay. They were going back no matter what, you know. They were going back. Now, Operation Big Switch, which took place after the armistice, that's where the majority of them stayed back. The minority went back north. But interesting thing that when I was, the first thing got off the train, I started departing prisoners, they had these loudspeaker systems, and they were reading off prisoners, American prisoners, and, well, I should say United Nations prisoners. And they were reading these names off, and about the 10th, 15th name, something like that, come across Richard A. Morrison. Well, Richard A. Morrison was a kid that I knew had been a prisoner of war. He was in Japan prior to the war. He was in the 24th Division, and he'd been captured and had been in North Korea ever since the first initial stages of the war. And so apparently he was not very good health, and they repatriated him, and I couldn't get up to see him, but I recognized the name, and he was repatriated. And in years to come, my folks told, he had been, well, back up a minute here, a little bit of this, they were having some brainwashing with some of these prisoners, and I don't know if you experienced this in Vietnam or not, but they had some of these interrogators had worked with some of these American prisoners and United Nations prisoners, and they became indoctrinated, and they were making recordings and that, trying to convince the people, the governments to end the war, etc. Well, Dick Morrison apparently made one of these. I never seen it or never knew for sure he did, but we were told that he did. So after the war, he went back to work where his dad had worked and wanted to work on the railroad. My folks told me that the FBI and the government came around for several months afterwards wanting to know if they noticed anything unusual about him, you know. Well, they didn't. He wasn't about to cause any problems. He just wanted to go back and raise a family, which he did, you know. But anyhow, we made 2 of those round trips in these trains, and that was the most interesting experience I had the whole time I was in the service. And then after the armistice, of course, which was in August, we only had a few more months to go before I started rotating home. And I received my notice to rotate home, I think around the 1st of November of '53, and left out of there I think just before Thanksgiving, and I got home direct ship to San Francisco. I believe it was around the first week in December, as I recall, maybe the 10th. Went to Camp Stoneman, Colorado, which is now Fort Stoneman, and or Stoneman, not either. No, that's not right. I can't think of that camp out there, that fort out there now. It isn't Stoneman, that's in California. My mind went blank, I'm
Carson.
sorry. There it is, Fort Carson, Camp Carson, Fort Carson, yeah. Which I've been back to since when I've been on Colorado. It's quite different. Everything's really nice out there. They got masonry buildings and everything's permanent. But anyhow, we got back there, and I took the train home that evening. Of course, being in Burlington, it was part of the Zephyr at that time, went from Denver to Chicago and rode all night across the Salt Lakes and on into home the next morning. And I just got home about 6 o'clock in the morning, something like that, and rang the doorbell. My dad come down, and oh goodness, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm home, you know. And, you know, it was nice. They knew I was coming, but they didn't know exactly when, you know. And so it was a good reunion. And after that, you know, I went around to see some of my friends, and they, surprisingly enough, they didn't even know most had even left, you know. They just, you know, where have you been, you know, in a combat zone for the last year and a half or so, whatever, you know. But the GIs came back from Korea, they just went back to work, you know, they really did. It wasn't Vietnam veterans. Vietnam veterans were treated so poorly due to the negative aspects of that whole war. That really wasn't the case with Korea. We felt that although we didn't win this war, we did stop the communist aggression, you know. And I went back to Kansas City and fully intent upon going back to school. I never did go back and finish my degree. I went to Rockhurst University in Kansas City there at nighttime, and came within a few hours of getting a degree, but went into construction work, which I dearly loved. I worked in the field for a while, then I became in management, then I became a division manager in Illinois. Ended up moving here to Atlanta and going into my own business for the last about 12, 14 years. And my wife, Carol, and I have been married 57 years as of last month. The first part of this month, actually, November 6th. And we've had 4 children and 7 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild, but it's in-law type thing, not blood descent. And that's about it. Presently 80 years old, a little over, almost 81. I think that's about as complete as I can get. Do you have any further questions you want to ask me, or?
I was curious if you had learned much Korean as a result of your job assignments.
Yeah, you know, this is interesting enough, and we explained this in our Tell America program that I wrote for the Korean War veterans. We take it around to the various schools in the area. The Japanese was the language of Korea when we were there. It had been for probably 40 years prior to. The Japanese embedded themselves in Korea. This is not North and South, this was just one Korea. And they had taken over that country due to some flimsy treaties they had entered into with China and Manchuria. And they ran that government, and Japanese was the official language of Koreans. Now, when we were dealing with the Koreans in our groups, they intermixed Korean language with Japanese language, so you picked up a little bit of everything. And I became somewhat functional in it, at least for what I had to do with them, those ones that worked with us. And they picked up enough English that they could work with us, and surprisingly enough, we got along pretty good. Keep in mind that this was just done on a day-to-day work basis, nothing on a social basis, you know. But since then, of course, South Korea has outlawed all Japanese. It's been expunged from all of their records, and they took care of that right away as soon as they were invaded. As soon as they became South Korea after the end of World War II, then they just got rid of everything in Japanese. There's no Japanese. But they had taken over everything. They increased their educational system. They did a lot of, the Japanese developed the country a lot. From about 1906, I think it is, until 1945. And they ran the show. Yeah.
When you were, prior to your entry into the service, how aware were you of what was happening in Korea?
We weren't aware of it. I mean, I guess I was concerned with other things, you know. I had just finished 2 years of community college, which the community college I went to was a type of college courses. You took all the college courses which were preparatory to the University of Iowa. So you just went right from there into the University of Iowa. You transferred all your grades, and mine was in business administration. And so you didn't lose a step. You just went right on in there. You just went to school at your hometown, you know. And so I was just primarily interested in education and knowing that I wanted to work a year and then go back to school. And Korea was something we didn't even know about, you know, we didn't ever heard of it, you know. And I never paid a whole lot of attention to it until it looked like that they were going to be pushed off the peninsula, and then people started to pay attention to that, you know. Prior to that, it wasn't pretty part of the news very much, but it did become a part of it, say, right in about September or so, August and September of 1950, then you began to notice it. And of course, then when they said they'd be home by Christmas, everybody thought, well, this thing's over with, you know, they'd be back home. But that wasn't the case after they invaded there, what was it, November 23rd of 1950, the Chinese came in with 200 and some odd thousand troops. And that was interesting to see what happened after that, you know.
I'm trying to get a timeline in my head. So was this before, after the landings at Incheon is when you came in country?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Right,
Yeah, he came in
they made the Incheon landing. Let me try to figure this out a minute.
I think that was about October of 50.
Yeah. Yeah, they came in, they started pushing down south, and that's when the Pusan perimeter started tightening up, and then, yeah, probably in October.
Okay.
And they landed at Incheon, right.
What about the Korean population where you were? How were you received?
Oh, well, we were received very well. In fact, you're received very well to this day over there. You go back, and I've been back 3 times to Korea. I went back in 49, in 1979, 1981, and then I went back under what they call the South Korean government has a program for veterans called Revisit, and they pay all your expenses and give you partial allowance on the airlines. So I went back on that program in 97. But it's in 1979 and 1981, I went back on my own. We had a daughter over there, was teaching English. She had graduated from college, was teaching English over at 2 of the girls' schools there. And then we toured the whole country in 79. My wife and I did. It was our 25th wedding anniversary. And so we toured the whole country from Panmunjom clear down to Jeju-do. And everywhere you went, the Korean people, and even to this day, they welcome you with open arms. I mean, some of the younger people, they're a little resentful. The rabble-rousers, you're always going to have an element of those no matter where you go. But the Korean people are very, very good people. They're very industrious people. You wouldn't believe the country of South Korea from what I knew. When I went back in 97 there on the revisit program, as I told them, when I went through Seoul on one of my trips up north, there wasn't a building over 2 stories high, you know. And when you went back in 79, I never seen so many tower cranes in my life. I mean, you know, they were literally bumping into each other, you know. And that whole country is just, it's unreal. They're just as modern as anything around here. Highway systems, trains, infrastructure, the countryside is modern in farming methods. You know, right now, and I don't think anybody in this country is aware of it, but the United States has been pulled back all of their troops. They used to be in downtown Seoul, that was headquarters, and they really didn't have any business being there, and it was just kind of it was just out of character for the rest of the city, you know, and so they pulled back quite a ways. And we're presently building, in cooperation with the South Korean government, a huge city just for United States forces. It's going to have colleges, they're building it right now, billions of dollars involved. High schools, grade schools, living quarters. I mean, it's a modern auditoriums, the whole works, you know, and this is strictly be for United States personnel. And they had some pictures of it at one of our veterans lunches once here a few months ago, and it's amazing what they're doing. They've taken land and reclaimed it and built walls around this, dikes, if you will, around this river area. And so they'll be kind of out of sight, out of mind to the rest of the Koreans, you know, kind of have a lower profile, but still have a strong presence, you know. Yeah.
The total troop level today is what, about 25,000?
Yeah, around, it's less than 30,000, I think. They're kind of reducing it a little bit at a time. Yeah. Right.
In closing, is there any general comment or about your service or anything in general that you'd like to make?
Well, I reflect back on it now, and I think it's the best experiences I had. It gave me an idea of just how to work under different, entirely different conditions, different kind of work, you know. It was military work, and I always said if I could have had the same duty in the States as I had overseas, I would probably re-upped. Our signal officer that worked with me, this is maybe a little interesting too, I forgot about it. Mr. Lesser, he was our personnel officer, and he was a Southerner from Alabama. And Mr. Lesser was part of the old school from the South, and he was not as tolerant of the blacks as you'd like to think they should be, you know. And so whenever we had some blacks come into the unit, they were rotated out to the most ungodly camps we had. And this one time, this one fellow came through, and he'd been a radio telegrapher, and he was very good at radio operations. He knew him up, put us to shame, you know. And Mr. Lester assigned him to one of the outlying camps, and it just wasn't right. It just flat wasn't right. So several of us went to Colonel Wynn and told him about the situation. He wasn't aware of it. He wasn't that close to it. And Mr. Lester was reprimanded and went on his records. And after that, why, he had to look at the blacks in an entirely different light. But you know, that time, Truman had just integrated the services during what, in 1947, 48. So there were a lot of these older fellows just weren't used to that, you know, simple as that. But right now, of course, then we started working with blacks, no problem, you know, we got along fine with them. But that was an interesting experience also that we had. We actually had to report him to, in a nice way, you go to the lieutenant colonel, he was a lieutenant colonel, and tell him Mr. Lesser is kind of not being fair. You know, I can't remember exactly how we handled it, but I know in essence that's what we did. But I worked with veterans organizations since and still have a liking for it. And
So you're a member of the Korean War Veterans Association?
Korean War Veterans, I'm a lifetime member and have been for about, I don't know, almost since its inception. Yeah. And we have our Tell America program, which we're educating students, primarily in the middle schools about it, and this is something we enjoy doing. There's about 7 or 8 of us in the chapter out here that are involved in that, and we hope to continue to do it.
Anything else?
I don't think so. We thank you very much for your time, sir. This has been fascinating. Can't really think of any other questions.
No, good.
I really appreciate the offer to be interviewed.
Well,
And I hope some of it does some good somewhere along the line, that some of them are reviewing it in the future, kind of get a cross view of some of us that did some of the nuts and bolts stuff, you know, on support work.
yeah. Well, I mean, really, we take the opportunity to thank you for coming here and telling us what this, and thanks for your service.
Okay,
Thank you.
appreciate it.
On the records of your brother, you can get those. And I